Yes, because you're up.
Just waiting here.
Perfect.
They wanted to do a...
Cool. You're up first.
Yes, I am.
Okay, cool. Go ahead and get ready because we're gonna.
Okay, I'm
gonna.
ready.
Okay, cool. I'm sitting right there with the yellow backpack. I'll try to keep an eye on you. Perfect. I'll listen to that. Let me know when you're ready. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Sam Burden. I'm an assistant professor in electrical engineering at the University of Washington in Seattle. If you recognize my name but not my face, you may know me as the ghost host from last year I co-organized but didn't actually end up being able to attend. So if you'd like to chat with me, I'd be more than happy to talk in person at this meeting. Please find me in a break. I'm happy to be chairing the contact planning and sensing session. I'm going to be very careful about courteously keeping everything on time and moving swiftly. Are you all set, Jason?
I hope so. Let's see if I get it my next slide here. So I'm Jason Cortell, and I work with Andy Arena at Cornell University, and we're working on this robot called TikTok. Been working on it for a couple years, and I've been showing CAD models for a long time now. I'm just going to show briefly where the mechanical part of it is now. And this is supposed to be a robot that can perform almost as well as the Boston Dynamics robots, but with 10 times less energy use, about the same cost of transport as a human. That's all I'll say about the robot itself. Mostly I'm going to be talking about the robot feet. So the robot feet project is something that a lot of undergrads have been working on, and these are the students from the last year or so. They've done an enormous amount of work on it. I just want to acknowledge that. So what do we want from a foot design? I'm not going to talk about everything here, but one of the important things we've been looking at is how do we get some padding or elasticity in the foot so that we don't have, when a hard robot foot hits a hard surface, we don't want it to bounce. And on a related note, we want to sort of have a mechanical low-pass filter on those collision forces coming in from the foot so that our sensors and our control systems can deal with it more easily. We want a smooth progression from heel strike to toe off. We don't want intermediate collisions. We want, and this is mostly what I'm going to be talking about today, we want to be able to sense the ground reaction forces, their position and amplitude if we can, but especially the position. And then finally, we're designing a foot that we want to get some mechanical assistance for push-off. So if you just have a flat foot, the gear ratio, the effective gear ratio, is not really great for push-off. But if you have a curved bottom surface, you can get a better mechanical advantage through the course of push-off, and if you put in a springy forefoot structure. And then this whole design is supposed to be about lightweight, so we can move the leg really quickly. And the other things we can talk about later if anybody has questions.
And you don't want to use a prosthetic foot?
We can talk about that later. So we explored a variety of different designs. This is the Ranger foot design here, and it was an aluminum structure, sort of like a load cell almost, that measures the force of heel strike, but it doesn't measure anything at the toe. We had students exploring different kinds of these carbon fiber leaf spring feet, which are still interesting. I hope we can get back to them. And then we looked at different ways to 3D print padding for the sole of the foot. I think there's an Adidas shoe maybe that uses this kind of 3D printed structure. And then finally we ended up with, for now, this rounded carbon fiber shell that's with a foam core. And it's extremely strong and extremely light. So this thing weighs about 50 grams.
50 or 15?
50, yes. So just looking at the structure of it, inside it's this polyurethane foam. You can't really see the carbon fiber shell here. And then we have a squishy polyurethane foam here. And then finally on the very outside is a very tough, harder outer layer of polyurethane rubber. Okay, and so then we looked at how to put foot sensors, foot pressure sensors, or some kind of contact sensor on there. And for measuring people's, for foot pressure distribution, there are these several commercial systems, SCAN and PDAR. If people know more about them, certainly, if anybody knows about them, please tell me. But they are thin, two-dimensional arrays of up to hundreds of different sensing elements. And they're made in a couple of layers, and it's a proprietary process, and it's very customized. And so we might like to have something like that, but it's not something that we can do in our lab very easily, at least not right now. I think we might try it this summer just because. But then they have certain kinds of hysteresis and other errors. So then the other alternative that's been used by a number of people, for example, saying by Kim, is you buy these little barometric pressure sensors, or in this case, this is a diving pressure sensor for a diving watch. And then you put them on a printed circuit board and you put a bunch of them, and then you kind of have sensing on the bottom of your foot. And the nice thing about that for a lab is even though it's kind of at some level more complicated and it doesn't scale well with the number of sensors, it's a standard electronics assembly process that we can do in our lab, or we can hire someone to do it. We had one very energetic student, Reese, who made this sensing system. So we have a bunch of different sensor spacings, and then we have a layer of rubber, and he made a machine that would push a force in known locations, and he got these results. So the question is, how sensitive is, so you have a sensor that's buried in some thickness of rubber, and the question is, how much sensing away from the axis of the sensor do you get? And as you expect, as you get farther away, so 5 millimeters here, that's very thin. At 2.5 millimeters, we're down to only about a third of the sensitivity. And then it drops off at 5, it's basically 0. And so if you look through all these similar pattern, it drops off rapidly, and then by the time you get to a radius equal to the thickness of the rubber from the sensor, you're basically at 0. So conclusion is that you want your sensors, if you want a continuous sensing, your sensors need to be something like the same at the spacing of the thickness of the rubber, or closer if you can. All right, and on our foot that we've built so far, we have 15 sensors arranged in 2 dimensions. They look like that. The important thing about this slide is that I want to show you is that the board, which is this green thing, if I can do it carefully, the printed circuit board, flexible printed circuit board, is inside the carbon fiber shell, and the sensors stick out through holes, and it's all epoxied in. So structurally, it should be very resistant to impact and so forth coming from the ground. All right, and one of the things that the students I had to learn was how do you make carbon fiber. So this is a vacuum bagging setup here. You wrap your part, you soak your carbon fiber with epoxy, and then you wrap your part with plastic, and then you suck the air out of it, and it squeezes the carbon and squeezes out the excess epoxy. So you end up with something that hopefully will match your mold. So this is another shot of that, and here is our 3D printed mold, and that's the carbon fiber part that comes out of it. That's just half of the foot, and then we have 2 halves that glue together. All right, here's our sensor electronics. So this is a flexible printed circuit board, and then here's with all the sensors soldered on. Here it is with glued inside the foot. On top of the foot is an IMU board that also has the pressure sensor signal conditioning and multiplexing, so it can address all the different sensors. And that goes on top of the foot. And then there's the foot. Here it is filled up with polyurethane. Obviously, our carbon fiber gluing is not the best because it leaked out. And then finally, we overmold the foot with the flexible padding. And then what I don't show here is we have another step that we have to try to put on the hard rubber on the outside. For my initial sample one, we just kind of painted it on, which didn't work very well. I think that's everything I've got, and if anybody has any questions. I do have a lot of, sorry, I have one more slide just talking about my questions here. So what's good about it is it should be durable, lightweight. We succeeded in that. Our goal is 150 and it's under that. The level of padding seems about right. It's a very labor-intensive process and the parts are pretty expensive. And we can't really get the sensors closer together because of the size. That's about as many as we can get in there. And also, it's basically not repairable. If the board breaks, can't replace the parts. So looking at buying a commercial sensor array, if we can find someone to make it for us, or we can try to figure out how to make our own. We can try to use the sensors in bare die form. They're little tiny things. And then we'd also like to maybe have shoes on it instead of the padding, so the separable shoes. Okay, any questions?
Okay, great. Let's start with Art's question.
Yeah.
Of why not a prosthetic foot? If I understood the
Question correctly. Yeah, I think we can't actually integrate a prosthetic foot into the robot very well. But we can certainly copy them and try to figure out a way to try to find a way to get the sensing and so on into a similar prosthetic foot.
So you can get a 6-axis load cell in a tibial pylon, and then then everything attaches with standard prosthetic adapters.
I think those are much too heavy and expensive for what we're trying to do and fragile. But I'm not sure. If you have a particular one in mind, I'd be interested to see it.
Well, maybe a more pointed question, which is I thought the question that was being asked is, are there any principles of prosthetic foot design that you could or did incorporate into the design of your robot foot?
Only vaguely. I think we will be moving in that direction I think this is not the last foot design for the robot.
Yeah.
Where's the... Okay, so just to make a comment about the prosthetic foot on the robot. So there's Sarcos, the robotic company that actually built a robot with a prosthetic foot with a passive ankle. And so now the robot is in Germany, in Tübingen, and we are currently trying to make it walk. So just to mention that this is doable, and this is ongoing research on this kind of robot. So.
Okay, thank you.
Amos?
So you have a foam layer between the ground and the sensors. And so when you take a step, I would think you'd kind of qualitatively see the COP translate on the foot. You also want to back out your ground reaction force vectors, right? So how would you do that from the sensor data? Because you need to know the orientation really well, and you're going to get multiple sensors triggered, I think, at the same time.
I think we're not going to get all of the tangential ground reaction forces from this arrangement. We have to try to derive it in some other way. But it would be a nice thing to have, and that's why I'm interested in looking at 6-axis load cells or other sensor arrangements that might do it.
Great. Yep.
Here we go.
If you're planning on closing the loop around these sensor measurements, are you worried about the inherent dynamics of this foam structure interfering with that? So you're using...
It's not going to be any sort of closed loop control. It's not nearly, and also, I think that the foam doesn't introduce dynamics that we care about because the frequency of them would be so high, but it does introduce a lot of error, right? So we can't trust it quantitatively. It's almost more of a qualitative measurement. We can try to calibrate it, but at least for the first run, it's going to be a qualitative measurement of about how much force. Are there multiple forces? Where are they located more or less on the foot? A load cell under the robot? What? I think it's important to be able to sense the ground itself. We don't expect, this is perhaps looking to the future when it's walking on things that are not flat concrete, but have rocks or bumps. Does that make sense? maybe not something we need the full functionality of immediately when we're first getting it to walk.
We still have another minute for questions, so put your thinking caps on. A question that I saw from Slack that's not directly related to the foot, but maybe what you were talking about at the beginning. How much of the expected energetic reduction comes from just losing, relative to, say, Atlas, I think is what you said, comes from weight reduction versus, smart dynamics controls, things like that?
Well, none of it comes from weight reduction because, well, it does come from weight reduction, but but we're not doing it by weight, right? The cost of transport is weight independent. So, but how do we get it down? We did simulations on putting the robot through a human walking motion, and then we optimized our transmissions to do that. It would have been even better to put it through a robot walking motion, but we didn't have that, so it's optimized for a human motion.
Yeah, please.
Is it correct that you don't want to store any energy in these feet? And if not, how come?
We're not trying to store energy in these feet, and it's mostly a question of weight and maybe also philosophy. We're not trying to do that right now. I am interested in, perhaps in the future, going to one of those carbon fiber feet like Amos has. Right? No, not carbon fiber, but the shape with the energy storage would be interesting. All right.
Any other questions while we go? Well, let's thank Jason.